In the desolate sands of the Arabian desert, one man made the ultimate sacrifice to stop a nightmare from escaping, a nightmare that still haunts those who live to tell the tale. Welcome to Eerie Road Tales, where we explore the darkest and most spine-chilling stories you've never heard. Tonight, we take you inside a mission gone wrong, a tale of terror, survival, and sacrifice in the face of an unspeakable evil. Stay with us as we uncover the gripping story of Lee, a reluctant hero whose actions saved the world but came at the ultimate cost. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Eerie Road Tales. It's free, and it helps us bring more terrifying stories like this to you every week. Now, let's step into the sands of horror. It was 1991, in the midst of the Gulf War, when the desert sands of northern Arabia became the setting for a mission that would transcend the bounds of human understanding. A squad of elite soldiers, hardened by countless battles, was dispatched to a remote chemical weapons facility. The orders were clear: secure the facility, neutralize any threats, and report back. But beneath the surface of those orders lay something much darker, a truth their commanders had chosen not to share. What awaited them was not merely the horrors of war, but something ancient, something primal, something far beyond their training. The journey to the facility was grueling. The unrelenting heat bore down on them, the sun an ever-present adversary as they moved through miles of barren desert. Their convoy kicked up clouds of sand, a pale imitation of the storms that would soon test their very survival. The air was heavy with tension, though none of them spoke it aloud. These were men trained to keep moving forward, to face danger head-on without question. Among them was Lee, the kind of Marine who never let his guard down, not even for a second. His silence was unnerving to some, but those who knew him understood it came from a place of deep pain. Lee carried more than his share of equipment that day, but what weighed him down most wasn't in his pack. It was the guilt, the crushing memory of a mission gone wrong. He had been the only survivor, and he wore that burden like a scar no one could see. Every step forward seemed to echo with the names of the men he couldn't save, their voices lost to time but never to him. For Lee, this mission wasn't just another operation. It was a chance to finally balance the scales, to do something that mattered in a way he could live with, or die for. As the facility came into view, it stood like a monolith in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless dunes. From a distance, it looked like just another bunker, weathered and unremarkable. But the closer they got, the more oppressive the air seemed to grow. Even the desert, with all its desolation, carried a kind of stillness that didn't feel natural. The squad exchanged glances but said nothing. They'd seen their share of strange things in the field, and silence was their way of coping with the unknown. Villagers from a nearby settlement had tried to warn them, though none of the soldiers had paid much attention at the time. Their interpreter relayed stories of a cursed land, a place where the sand itself seemed alive. They spoke of ruins beneath the facility, remnants of an ancient city swallowed by the desert thousands of years ago. At the heart of those ruins, they claimed, lay the domain of a forgotten god, a deity of wrath and sand whose power could reduce entire armies to nothing more than whispers on the wind. The squad laughed it off. Superstition wasn't something they had room for in their world of orders and protocols. But those stories lingered in the back of their minds, as such tales often do. The first night in the facility confirmed what none of them dared to voice. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the sandstorm that rolled in, though that alone was enough to unnerve them. The storm came with a ferocity they hadn't seen before, slamming into the facility with almost surgical precision. The wind howled in a way that felt unnatural, as if it were alive, carrying with it a sound that could only be described as a scream buried deep within the storm, faint yet unmistakable. It rattled their nerves in a way no battle ever had. Inside, the facility felt more like a tomb than an operational outpost. The air was thick, heavy, with an unexplainable weight that pressed down on them. Shadows stretched further than they should have, flickering even when the wind outside seemed to ease. Equipment malfunctioned at random, radios crackling with static or emitting strange bursts of sound that no one could explain. Some men joked that it was the desert playing tricks on them, but the laughter was hollow, forced. Lee said nothing during those early hours. He simply stared at the walls, his jaw clenched, his hands never straying far from his weapon. The others thought he was just being cautious, but there was something in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, that none of them understood. Whatever was out there, whatever was coming, Lee seemed to know it was only a matter of time before they met it. The storm didn't let up that night, its fury growing stronger with every passing hour. What started as an unusual weather event had become something far more sinister. It wasn't just the wind or the sand. It was the feeling that the storm was alive, watching, waiting. The men began to feel it too, though none of them dared to say it. How could they? They were soldiers, trained to fight human enemies, not whatever this was. As the hours dragged on, a deep unease settled over the squad. They didn't know it yet, but the storm wasn't the only thing alive in that desert. Something far older and far angrier had been disturbed, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The squad advanced into the bunker with the precision of soldiers who had done this 100 times before. Their movements were fluid, each man covering his sector, sweeping corners, and maintaining tight formation. The corridor walls were lined with peeling paint, the air thick with the scent of rust and mildew. Overhead, flickering fluorescent lights buzzed intermittently, casting uneven shadows that seemed to leap and shift with each step. Outside, the storm grew louder, the howling wind a constant reminder of the chaos beyond. But the deeper they moved into the facility, the more they felt a quiet unease creeping in, as though the storm wasn't just pressing against the walls, it was following them. Despite their training, the men couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. It wasn't the kind of threat they were used to, no clear enemy waiting with a rifle or hidden explosive. This was different, something primal, an instinctive fear that prickled the back of their necks. Every creak of the floor, every faint echo of their boots against the metal, seemed amplified, like the facility itself was alive and aware of their intrusion. Roy, their leader, signaled with a clenched fist, halting the squad as they reached a junction. They crouched in silence, weapons raised, their breathing controlled but heavy. Even Roy, the calmest among them, seemed on edge. As they pushed further in, the faint sounds of distant gunfire echoed through the halls. It was sporadic, frantic, and growing fainter. The Romanian Republican Guard had been stationed here ahead of their arrival, a detail they hadn't been told until moments before deployment. Now, their presence was reduced to a chilling backdrop of chaos, an audible reminder that something had gone terribly wrong. The squad reached a large observation deck overlooking the main chamber of the facility, where the first true horrors of the mission revealed themselves. Below, the remains of the Romanian Guard were scattered like ragdolls. Weapons, helmets, and bodies lay strewn across the floor, many of them disintegrated beyond recognition. And in the center of the carnage, something moved. It struck without warning. A swirling mass of sand and shadow erupted from the far corner of the chamber, consuming the remaining guards with terrifying efficiency. The shape of the entity was never static. One moment it appeared humanoid, the next a chaotic whirlwind. It tore through everything in its path, the guards' desperate gunfire disappearing into its form without so much as a flinch. Grenades exploded against it, sending bursts of shrapnel into the air, but the creature reformed effortlessly. This wasn't a creature. It wasn't human or animal. It was a force of nature, a manifestation of fury and death. "Jesus Christ," Harris whispered, his voice trembling as he gripped his rifle tighter. "What the hell is that?" Roy didn't answer. His voice, calm but strained, broke the silence. "Weapons free." The squad opened fire, their rifles roaring as they unleashed a torrent of bullets into the chamber. The entity recoiled slightly, as though momentarily disoriented, but it quickly reformed, the sand swirling faster, almost as if mocking their efforts. Despite the futility, they kept firing. Bullets ricocheted off the walls or disappeared into the swirling void, leaving no visible impact. As the entity shifted its attention upward, the squad realized it had taken notice of them. Its form elongated, reaching toward the observation deck like a massive, grasping hand made of sand and malice. Roy shouted for everyone to fall back, but one man refused. Lee stayed at his position, his L-86 rifle spitting round after round into the storm. The sand lashed out at him, shredding the outer layers of his NBC gear, tearing into his uniform, and burning the skin beneath. Still, he didn't move. His jaw was set. His eyes locked on the creature with a determination that defied reason. To Lee, retreat wasn't an option, not this time. He had made that mistake before, and it had cost the lives of men he called brothers. He wasn't going to let history repeat itself. "Lee, get the hell back," Roy shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony of gunfire and wind. The rest of the squad had already moved to the doorway, but Lee remained rooted in place, his defiance unshaken. "I've got it," Lee roared, reloading in one fluid motion and firing again. His squad yelled for him to retreat, but their voices were drowned out by the storm. The entity, as if amused by Lee's resistance, turned its full focus toward him. The sandstorm intensified, battering him relentlessly, but still, Lee stood his ground. Finally, Dexter lunged forward, grabbing Lee by the back of his gear and pulling him away. "You're no good to us, dead," Dexter yelled, dragging him toward the doorway. Lee resisted for a moment, his weapon still aimed at the creature, but eventually relented as the rest of the squad grabbed him and pulled him through the corridor. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound of the storm now muffled but still terrifyingly present. In the flickering light of the hallway, Lee's face was a mask of rage and exhaustion, his hands trembling as he clutched his rifle. The squad stared at each other, their breaths ragged, their faces pale. Whatever they had just faced wasn't over, not even close. The squad slammed the heavy steel door shut behind them, their breaths ragged as they leaned against the cold metal. The muffled roar of the storm outside didn't mask the tension that gripped them. Their weapons hung uselessly at their sides, their ammunition depleted with no visible effect on the nightmare pursuing them. The dim emergency lights overhead flickered, casting their faces in a haunting red glow. They were trapped, outmatched, and the weight of that realization was suffocating. Inside the makeshift shelter, arguments broke out, their voices trembling with fear and frustration. Harris paced back and forth, his hands running through his sweat-soaked hair. "We can't keep running," he said, his voice cracking. "That thing will tear through every door, every wall. What are we supposed to do? Roy stood in the center of the room, his hands pressed against the table, his head lowered as he tried to think of a plan. We regroup. We think, he muttered, though the words felt hollow even to him. In the corner, Lee sat silently, his rifle resting across his knees. His face was calm, almost unnervingly so, as he stared at the faint vibrations of the door, where the creature's relentless storm clawed at the bunker like a living beast. He didn't join the argument. He didn't need to. He already knew what needed to be done. Finally, his voice broke through the noise, steady but heavy with conviction. I won't let it escape. The room fell silent as everyone turned to him. He stood, his eyes unwavering as he looked at his squad mates. I failed my last squad, he said, his voice almost a whisper. I won't fail this one. Don't start that crap, Lee, Dexter snapped, stepping forward. Whatever happened before, it wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? Lee shot back, his voice rising. They're dead because I hesitated, because I couldn't make the hard call. I watched good men die, and I did nothing. Not this time. Harris shook his head, his voice filled with desperation. Lee, don't do this. We'll figure something out. There's got to be another way. There isn't, Lee said firmly. He took a deep breath, his expression softening. You've all got families waiting for you. People who'll notice if you don't come back. Me. I've got nothing. No one. So I'm making the call. Roy slammed his fist on the table, his frustration boiling over. We all go home, or no one goes home. That's the rule. No heroics, Lee. Lee gave a small, almost weary smile. Not heroics, Roy. Just the job. He reached up and unfastened his dog tags, handing them to Dexter. Make sure these get back to base. Lee, don't, Dexter pleaded, his voice cracking. But Lee didn't reply. He turned toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate. The room fell into stunned silence as the reality of his decision began to sink in. Roy grabbed his arm at the last moment, his voice shaking. Lee, we'll find another way. Just give us time. Lee turned back, his face calm but resolute. There's no time, Roy. You know that. He glanced around at the men he'd fought alongside, his brothers in arms. When you get out of here, raise a glass for me, yeah? First rounds on Royal Marine Albert Lee. Before anyone could stop him, he opened the door and stepped into the storm. The howling wind swallowed him whole, the sand tearing at his silhouette as he disappeared into the chaos. Inside, the squad stared at the now closed door, the weight of their helplessness crashing down on them. Dexter clenched his fists, his knuckles white. He's really doing it, he whispered. Harris wiped his face with trembling hands. Damn him. Damn him for making us leave. The radio crackled suddenly, and Harris jumped to answer it. The pilot's voice cut through the static. Extraction team inbound. Hold your position. But no one moved. They couldn't. The sound of Lee's rifle echoed faintly through the storm, a steady rhythm of defiance against the impossible. Lee, Dexter muttered under his breath, a lump in his throat. Now, before we continue, you've got to make a hard call too. Hit that subscribe button and help us keep these tales of terror coming. You're not saving the world like Lee, but hey, at least you'll never miss a story. The storm howled relentlessly as Lee stepped into the chaos, his figure quickly swallowed by the swirling wall of sand. The squad huddled behind the heavy door, each of them straining to hear the faint sound of his footsteps before the wind consumed them. And then, cutting through the roar of the storm, came the sharp, rhythmic bursts of Lee's rifle. The relentless rattle echoed down the hall like a defiant heartbeat, each shot a testament to his unwavering resolve. He moved deeper into the bunker, baiting the entity with calculated precision. The sandstorm seemed to respond to him, its fury intensifying, the walls vibrating under its power. Lee's voice crackled faintly over the radio, calm yet resolute. "It's following me. Get ready to blow it. No hesitation." Inside the chemical weapons room, Lee made his stand. The creature descended upon him with unrelenting malice, its form shifting and swirling as it filled the space. Lee fired relentlessly, his weapon a roar of defiance against the entity. The sand lashed out at him, tearing away his gear and slicing into his skin, but he didn't falter. As the storm reached its crescendo, Lee's voice came through the radio one final time. "Do it. Now." The explosion that followed was deafening. A thunderous roar shook the ground, sending a shockwave through the entire facility. The walls groaned and buckled as fire and pressure consumed the room. For a moment, there was silence. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if the very desert held its breath. The squad, still huddled near the extraction point, felt the tremor beneath their feet. Harris looked at the others, his face pale but resolute. "He did it," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. The faint traces of relief were short-lived, replaced by a growing sense of dread as the air around them began to change. The storm didn't die. It grew. The sand outside, momentarily stilled by the explosion, began to rise again, swirling faster, darker, more furious than before. And then it came, the scream. A sound unlike anything they had ever heard, primal and piercing, a howl of pure rage that seemed to tear through their very souls. The men dropped to their knees, clutching their heads as the unearthly wail reverberated through the air. Dexter looked toward the door, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's not over," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The sandstorm, now a towering vortex, surrounded the facility, trapping them in a nightmare that refused to end. The radio crackled to life. "Extraction team inbound. ETA 2 minutes." The pilot's voice cut through the noise. The squad scrambled to their feet, moving toward the designated extraction point. As they climbed into the waiting helicopter, the storm seemed to follow, its tendrils of sand lashing out at the rotors. The squad sat in silence, their faces pale and etched with exhaustion as they lifted off. Inside the chopper, Colonel Starkey waited, his expression unreadable. As the doors slammed shut and the helicopter gained altitude, Harris finally snapped. "You knew," he yelled, his voice trembling with rage. "You sent us in there to die." The colonel didn't flinch. His voice was calm, almost detached. "It takes warriors to slay monsters," he said coldly, his words cutting through the tension. "And make no mistake, that thing is no ordinary monster. You used us." Dexter spat, his fists clenched. "Lee is dead because of you." The colonel met their anger with icy indifference. "What you did here today prevented a global catastrophe. You saw what that thing is capable of. If it had escaped—" He trailed off, letting the weight of his implication hang in the air. "But at what cost?" Harris shouted, his voice cracking. You didn't just lose a soldier. You lost a man who gave everything to save us. And you sit there like it doesn't matter. For a moment, the colonel's gaze softened, but only briefly. Lee will be remembered as a hero, he said quietly. But heroes are often the price we pay to keep the rest of the world safe. The squad sat in silence, their grief mixing with fury as the helicopter carried them away from the storm. Below, the desert raged, the storm now an unstoppable force. The faint outline of the facility disappeared into the swirling sands, and with it, any hope that the nightmare had truly ended. As the chopper flew into the night, the squad knew one thing for certain. What they faced in that bunker wasn't gone. It was waiting, and it would return. What do you think Lee faced in that bunker? Was it a force of nature, a forgotten deity, or something else entirely? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your theories and let's uncover the truth together. And if stories of bravery and terror like this keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe to Eerie Road Tales. From unspeakable horrors to tales of the unknown, we've got plenty more to share with you. And remember, sometimes the greatest horrors aren't the monsters themselves, it's what they leave behind.